Hello everyone, welcome back. In today's video, we've got another season preview video. In today's video, we're looking at two teams from the Central Division. We've already looked at two teams earlier, and that was the Blues and the Blackhawks. Now we're looking at the Mammoth and the Avalanche. How those two teams do last year, how they do this offseason, and how are they shaping up going into the 2025-26 season. But to all the updates regarding these two teams coming up right now. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video here at the End-to-End Hockey channel. Now before we get started, don't forget to like this video and subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this with all of you guys, so if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to leave a comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming out in the very near future. And once again, in today's video, we have a season preview video. So we've already talked about a handful of teams earlier. Today we are looking at the Utah Mammoth and the Colorado Avalanche. So as usual, we'll start off by looking at the team's stats from last year, see how they did. We'll look at the additions and subtractions these two teams made. We'll look at the trades that these two teams made and the team's top 3 picks in the 2025 draft. We'll then look at the offseason checklist I gave them in my offseason preview videos, see how many number of things on the checklist they completed in my opinion, and then we'll look at the team's lineup, my projected lineup for this upcoming season. We'll look at my predictions for this upcoming season, and we'll look at my offseason grade. So we'll start with the Utah Mammoth last year as the Utah Hockey Club. They had a pretty solid season, their first season in Utah. They had a 38, 31, and 13 record for 89 points. That's closer than the Arizona Coyotes got in a whole bunch of seasons to make a playoff berth. They were 6th in the Central, 10th in the West, and 19th in the NHL. So they were a really solid team. Missed the playoffs with only 7 points. So that was really solid stuff there from Utah after being relocated from the Arizona Coyotes. They wound up scoring 240 goals for and 247 goals against, so they're only a -7. It's not overly bad. I mean, they had a better plus minus than the Canadians, who made the playoffs with a -18. So still, it wasn't overly bad. Probably should have scored a couple more goals. Defense could have been a little bit better, but still, all in all, it wasn't an overly bad plus minus there for the Utah Mammoth. Goal and point scoring leaders. Keller led the team with 90 points. Cooley was second with 65, and Schmelz was third with 63. While Keller led the team with 30 goals. Gunther was second with 27, and Cooley was third with 25. So Cooley looks like he's going to have a monster career after having a 60-point season last year. Keller wound up hitting 90, which was a great improvement. And Gunther, I wouldn't be surprised this year if he was completely healthy to hit 40 goals. So they have some really good bright spots, especially from last year. But once again, offensive-wise, point-wise, they could be a little bit better. And once again, they did miss the playoffs, so there's no playoff stats to go off of for the Utah Mammoth. Next, going over to the team's additions and subtractions from this past season. So for their additions and subtractions, there's not a long list here. They added JJ Peterka in a trade from Buffalo, Brandon Tanev from Winnipeg, Nate Schmidt from Florida, Scott Peronovich from NYI, Vitek Vanecek from Florida, all in free agency, and as well as a 2027 third-round pick from Toronto. They lost Josh Doan to Buffalo, Matthias Michelli to Toronto, both via trade, Nick Bjugstad to St. Louis, Sam Walker's UFA, Michael Kesselring in a trade to Buffalo, and Robert Bertuzzo, who is also a UFA. So all in all, not overly bad. Like if you look at this team and look at how they added and subtracted, addition-wise in the forward group, they have Peterka and Tanev, and lose Dunn, Michelli, and Bjugstad as well as Walker. So they lose a tiny bit of depth. Walker wasn't an NHL player last year anyway, but they do lose a little bit of depth. Like I do think Peterka is going to be a stellar top 6 addition. Tanev will help replace guys like Michelli and Bjugstad in the bottom 6, and they have some younger guys who should be able to make the lineup this year. So I think like forward group, they got a little bit better. Defensively, they do lose Michael Kesselring and Robert Bertuzzo. They had Schmidt and Peronovich. Schmidt, I don't think is an overly big upgrade on Kesselring, but I do think he can help replace him. Peronovich is just going to help add some defensive depth. So like defensive wise, didn't get a whole bunch more worse. And in net, they had some insurance with Vanecek. With Ingram being in the NHL Players Assistance Program, not exactly sure how he was going to start the season. He needed some goalie insurance, so I think signing Vanecek really helps him with that. So all in all, I think a really solid offseason from Utah. That saw them got a whole bunch better. They made 2 trades this offseason, acquiring Peterka from Buffalo for Doan and Kesselring, and then trade Michelli to Toronto for a 2027 third-round pick. So a couple of really solid moves there from Utah, moving Michelli for a third, as well as getting JJ Peterka. Peterka. The top 3 picks on this team from this past year's draft, the first rounder, 4th overall thanks to the draft lottery. They wound up taking center Caleb Denwye, who I think eventually is going to be a solid top 6 center with a guy like Logan Cooley going forward. This upcoming season won't make the NHL lineup, but still, that's a really solid pickup there. Second round, 46th overall, they took right shot defenseman Pesenica, I think eventually could be a decent second, third pair defenseman. And the third round, 78th overall, they took Hodge, who's a left winger. And once again, I think eventually could challenge like a bottom 6, maybe 4th line role. So very interesting note there, but some really solid pickups here, especially the first rounder with 4th overall getting Denwye. Next, going over to my offseason checklist. So in my offseason preview video, I said 5 things that Utah should do in the offseason to get better and improve for this upcoming season. The first thing was to move Maccelli and or Krause. I feel like they have completed that. They did wind up moving off of Matthias Maccelli. Now they do still have Krause, but I said either one or both of, and they did move Maccelli, so I completely agree that this is one of the things that I have to check off my checklist for them, because they completed that, and I do think Maccelli will find a new home and be a solid player in Toronto, but I think it was just time to move off given all of the healthy scratches he was last year, and I think they completed that. The second thing I said this team should do was to add a decent backup if Ingram isn't healthy enough to start the season, and they did that. Ingram might be healthy enough to start the regular season, we're not exactly sure at this point in time, but they add Vanacek for some added depth. I mean, Vanacek was a backup last year for Florida on their Stanley Cup playoff run, so I definitely think Vanacek can provide some backup help for a guy like Kirill Vejmelka if Ingram is not able to go to the start of the season. So I feel like they completed that thing that I said they should do by adding Vanacek to back up Vejmelka if Ingram's not ready to start. The third thing I said this team should do was to go after an older top 6 forward, and I feel like they did that. Peterka's not overly old, but he is a little bit more experienced than some of the younger guys on that Utah roster. So I think long term this could be a very solid pickup here for the Utah Mammoth, and I do think it completes one of my goals for them as they do wind up adding a top 6 forward. The fourth thing I said this team should do is to give guys like Iginla, Boot, or Shimishev a shot at the NHL level. I feel like they did that. They did lose a little bit of depth, so I think they will have guys like Boot, Iginla, Shimishev, etc. all opportunities to play at the NHL level this upcoming season. So I do feel like to some extent they did wind up completing that. And lastly, my fifth thing on my offseason checklist for the Utah Mammoth was to add some defensive depth. I feel like they did that. They replaced losing guys like Bortuzzo and Kesselring with Schmidt and Peronovic. I do think that provides some added depth. They do still have a really solid defensive core without those two guys, but Schmidt's going to be a solid third pair guy, and Peronovic a solid call-up option. So I do feel like they also completed my fifth thing on my checklist, which was add some defensive depth. So all in all, they completed 4 of the 5 things, and they even did the 5th thing to some extent by having some open roster spots with their younger guys to potentially compete for. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to my lineup for the Utah Mammoth for 2025-2026 season. So as current point in time, my projected lineup for Utah for the 2025-2026 season is as follows. The top line is Peterka with Cooley and Keller. The second line is Gunther with Schmalz and Boot. The third line is Krause with Hayton and Tanev. And the fourth line is Kerfoot with Stenlund and O'Brien. The defensive pair 1 is Sergachev with Dursey. Defensive pair 2 is Simishev with Marino. And defensive pair 3 is Mata with Schmidt. Vejmelka is the starter. Vanacek's the backup. McBain, Cole, Vale, Mackey are 3 spares. And Ingram will either start the season on the non-roster or potentially be sent down, or potentially could be one of the extra spares. So not exactly sure about that. But that would be a very interesting roster. And it looks like a playoff roster in my opinion. So I think Utah has a really good, solid team right now. And I do think they'll be able to challenge for a playoff spot, which leads me to my predictions for the Utah Mammoth for the 2025-2026 season. So as it sits right now, I think Utah is bound to take a big step forward. I don't have them taking a huge step forward, but I think just a small step forward is going to be enough to get them into the postseason. I had them finishing this year with a record of 46, 27, and 9 for 101 points, 12 more than last year, finishing 3rd in the Central Division. I feel that they're able to take a step to get themselves into a top 3 spot in the Central. Like some of those other Central Division teams, one we'll talk about later today, and there's a couple of other teams too, didn't really get a whole bunch better than last year. Well, I think Utah definitely improved a whole bunch from last year. So in my opinion, I definitely think they are on pace right now, should they not run into a whole bunch of injuries and gel well together, especially with the Peterka addition, to go far this year. And I think a top 3 spot is completely attainable for the Utah Mammoth. So that's my current predictions for the Utah Mammoth for this upcoming season. And last, going over to my off-season grade. So like I said, they didn't do a whole bunch of movement this off-season, but I think their forward group got a little bit better, even though they lost a little bit of depth. Defensive-wise, pretty much the same as last year. Goaltending, they added some insurance with Vanchuk. Like, all in all, I think they had a really under-the-radar, solid offseason. So I'm going to give them a B-plus offseason. I don't think they had great offseason. Like, I think if they were to add a little bit more depth, maybe one more solid addition, I would have been able to give them an A rating. But I think with all the things they did this offseason, that's sort of warranted for how good of an offseason they had. So that's my opinion on the Utah Mammoth at this point in time. Next, going over to the Colorado Avalanche. So going over to the Colorado Avalanche, last year was a pretty sour start to the Avalanche, but they turned it up towards the last 3 quarters, second half of the season, and really finished with a solid record. Finished with a record of 49-29-4 last year for 102 points. 3rd in the Central, 5th in the Western Conference, 7th in the entire NHL. So they were a dominant team last year in the Western Conference and the entire league. So they were a top 10 team, which was pretty good there for the Colorado Avalanche. Nearly hit 50 wins after starting the season 0-4-0. Goals for, goals against wise last year for the Avalanche, they had 273 goals for and 231 goals against. So they were a plus 42 team, goals for, goals against wise, which isn't the best we've seen, but is one of the best that we've seen so far in these season preview videos. So that was a pretty solid season there, especially goal scoring wise from the Avalanche. Goal scoring wise, Nathan MacKinnon led the team with 32 goals. Makar was second with 30. Lehkonen was third with 27. So all in all, pretty solid goal scoring, especially with the Kyle Makar, a defenseman, hitting 30 goals. Like, that was nasty. While for the point scoring leaders, MacKinnon had 116 points, was one of the top point players in the entire NHL, and was a solid player in Colorado. Kyle Makar had 92 points as a defenseman, and Artturi Lehkonen had 45. So there's definitely a gap between second and third in point scoring in the Avalanche team last year, but still, MacKinnon and Makar led this team to a playoff spot again. Last year, they faced the second seed Dallas Stars in the first round. They would wind up having a really solid back and forth series, but collapse in the third period thanks to former Avalanche Mikko Rantanen would lead the Avalanche to a 7-game series loss in the postseason to the Dallas Stars, which wasn't overly good there for the Avalanche. So their playoff run came to an end abruptly after losing in 7 games in round 1. In the postseason, MacKinnon led the team with 11 points. O'Connor was second on the team with 6 points. Meanwhile, goal scoring wise, MacKinnon led the team with 7 goals, and then Lehkonen and Chushkin both had 3 goals, tied for second on the team. So all in all, pretty solid stuff there from the Avalanche in the postseason. But once again, it was really drived hard by MacKinnon, who had a fantastic season last year. Next, going over to their offseason additions and subtractions, there's a long list of additions and subtractions here for the Colorado Avalanche. So we'll start with their additions here. They added Alex Barboulay in free agency from Montreal, Olofsson in free agency from Vegas, Gushchin in a trade from San Jose, Brindley in a trade from Columbus, Attard from Edmonton, Akan from Boston, and Burns from Carolina, all in free agency, as well as a 2025 third-round pick from Columbus and 2027 second-round pick from Columbus in the Coyle trade. Meanwhile, they lost Jonathan Drouin to the Islanders, Ollie Austin in a trade to San Jose, Coyle and Wood in a trade to Columbus, VC, who signed overseas, Phillips, Dufour, Foodie, who all went to UFA status, Ludwig, who went overseas, Eric Johnson, who's currently a UFA, Ryan Lindgren, who signed in Seattle, and Callie Rosen, who signed in Washington. So if you look at this team, defensive-wise, like, they added Burns, who's going to really round out the defensive end. They also had Akan and Attard, who can be call-up options, but they did lose Ludwig, who's a solid call-up option, Rosen, who was a solid call-up option, Johnson, who was a solid 6'7" guy, and Lindgren, who they acquired at the deadline, who really fit in well in the top 4. So they did lose a whole bunch of solid depth to their blue line. Offensive wise, lost a couple of depth pieces like Phillips, like Dufour, like Foodie, like Ollie Austin. They also lost a couple of solid NHL level players like Drouin, like Coyle, like Wood, like VC. So they did lose a whole bunch of solid players, but they added Gushchin and Brindley, who should be young up and coming forwards there for the Colorado Avalanche. And they also added some younger players like Barboulay and Olsen, who should be able to be NHL level players. So once again, it wasn't overly great offseason there from the Avalanche. They lost a lot of depth. Forward group doesn't look the same. It's a little bit weaker. Defensive wise, you could say it's around the same, maybe a little bit better with Burns being on the third pair, but still it's not the same team as it was last year. So very interesting note there, but not a whole bunch of really great change there this offseason from the Colorado Avalanche. The Colorado Avalanche made 2 trades this offseason. The first one was trading Charlie Coyle and Miles Wood to the Columbus Blue Jackets for Gavin Brindley, a 2025 third-round pick and 2027 second-round pick. And then they traded Oscar Olofsson to the San Jose Sharks in exchange for Daniil Gushchin. So a couple of very interesting trades. I think they definitely won the Coyle one. I think to some extent they might have lost the San Jose one, but still very interesting trades there. Their top 3 draft picks from this past season were not very high. The first pick in 2025 was 77th overall, so a third-round pick. They took left shot defenseman Del Elche, who I think eventually could be a solid third-pair defenseman. 4th rounder, 118th overall, they took right shot defenseman Funk. And 7th round, 214th overall, they took center prospect Rode. So Rode, I think, eventually could be a call-up option for the Avalanche, while Funk and Del Elche, I think, in due time, could wind up challenging for like third-pair roles. So not bad pickups there for the Avalanche, but they only had 3 draft picks in the 2025 draft, so they didn't really have a whole bunch of top-end draft selections, so very interesting note there. Next, going over to my checklist from the offseason preview video. So once again, offseason preview video, I mentioned 5 things this Avalanche team should do to get better for this upcoming season in the offseason. The first thing I said they should do was to either sign Nelson or acquire a different second-line center. Now, they did sign Brock Nelson. It was definitely a hefty price. I don't overly like the contract, but I think this is a solid move there from the Avalanche to get some stability on the second-line center role. So they did complete the first thing on my checklist, as they did sign Nelson. The second thing on my checklist was to move one of Manson, Girard, or Colton, because those guys all had high price tags, high AAVs. They would have gotten the Avalanche some assets. I thought those would have been smart moves, but they wound up extending Josh Manson instead of moving him. And Jordan Colton, well, they have been mentioned at some points as potential trade candidates, have not been moved as of yet. So that's not something I can say they completed on my checklist, because they are all still on the team. So very interesting note there. The third thing that this team should do is to try and extend Martin Necas. Now, they might still do that, but at this current point in time, has not happened yet. So once again, I cannot say they completed the third thing on my checklist, because Necas is still an unsigned player in Colorado. So that was something that I thought was one of their top priorities they still haven't done. The fourth thing I said was to give guys like Oscar Olofsson, William Dufour, Ivan, or Sean Barans a shot at the NHL level. And I do think they will have a couple of young guys challenging for NHL level spots this year. Now, they did move off of Olofsson and Dufour. They didn't bring those 2 back. But Ivan, I think, will have a shot to make the NHL lineup at the 4 group. Barans maybe to some extent on the defensive end. And even some younger guys like a Prishchepov, I think, could also challenge for a 4 group spot. So I don't think it's those guys in particular, but I do think they'll have a couple of roster spots open who some of the younger guys could wind up trying to fill. So that's another option there. And the fifth thing I said this team should do in the offseason preview video for my checklist was to try and add some defensive depth. They did so by adding Brent Burns. I do think he'll help replace the loss of Ryan Lindgren and really make a solid third-pair defenseman in the Avalanche organization. So I said that those were the 5 things this team should do in the offseason to get better for next year, and they completed 3 of them. So I'm going to say that they definitely did a lot of the things I was expecting to do this offseason in my offseason checklist video. So very interesting note there. Next, going over to the lineup predictions I have for the 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, top line for the Avalanche, in my opinion, would be Necas with McKinnon and Lehkonen. Second line would be Landeskog with Nelson and Nichushkin. Third line would be Olofsson with Colton and Brindley. Fourth line would be Kelly with Drury and Ivan. On the defensive end, you'd have Taves McCarr first pair, Gerard Manson second pair, Malinsky Burns third pair. Blackwood would be the starter, Wedgwood would be a backup. You'd have Prishchepov, Berbule, and Attard as their 3 spares, so Connor starting on either injury reserve or long-term injury reserve. And I think that would be a cap-compliant roster and a really solid roster there for the Colorado Avalanche. Not as good as it was last year, but still a pretty solid roster that's going to be able to compete for the playoffs. So very interesting note there. And that leads me to my predictions for the Colorado Avalanche for this upcoming 2025-2026 season. So at this current point in time, I think they're going to be a team who challenges for a playoff spot. I don't think they're going to be for sure top 3 in the Central Division again this upcoming season. I think they're going to take a bit of a step back. And I don't think they're going to take too much of a step back, but with how many other teams in the Central Division got a whole bunch better this offseason and the West in general, I'm not sure if they're a playoff team anymore. So I'm going to make the bold claim that this team is going to ever so slightly by like a point or two, missed out on the playoffs. I had them finishing with a record of 42, 32, and 8 for 92 points, being 9th in the Western Conference, missing out on one of those last playoff spots for just like a point or two, maybe 3. So like, I think the Avalanche are going to be a team who I could easily see wind up making a wildcard spot in the Western Conference, but at this current point in time, I have ever so slightly missing out. So that's my predictions for the Avalanche at this point in time. And lastly, going over to my offseason grades for the Colorado Avalanche. So I don't really think you can look at this roster and say they got a whole bunch better from last year's roster that finished out in the playoffs. Like their defense, a little bit worse, especially with the loss of Lindgren. Offensively, definitely worse, especially with losing guys like Charlie Coyle and Jonathan Drouin. So all in all, I'm going to give this team a C rating for their offseason. Like I don't think they had a bad offseason per se, especially with the lack of cap space they had, but I can't say they really got a whole bunch better this offseason either. So I think a C rating is warranted given what the Avalanche did this offseason, even though they were tied up against the cap. So that's my opinion on the Colorado Avalanche, on the Utah Mammoth. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on these two teams. Is Utah poised to take a step forward and make the playoffs for the first time in Utah? Is Colorado poised to take a small step back, potentially missing the playoffs this year? Definitely love your thoughts on all of that down in the comment section below, and if you agree or disagree with me. But definitely, I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on all of that. That is all I'm going to talk about today. Remember to like this video, and for those who subscribe below. Thank you for all of your support. I would never be able to do this with all of you guys. So if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe button down below. Don't forget to comment. We're on the road to 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to stay tuned for more videos coming out in the very near future. Also, a blog to what news, rumors, analysis, stuff like that. So check that out. I've linked that down in the description below. Can't wait to see you guys all for the next video. See you guys soon.